There are monsters that do not hide beneath the bed. They sit at the family table, bow their heads before supper, and call themselves blood. For more than 70 years I carried a silence heavier than stone, and it has taken me this long to find the courage to speak. The cruelty I endured did not come from a stranger lurking in the shadows. It came from within the very walls I was meant to call home, from faces the world believed respectable, from the people who should have kept me safe. Tonight, I will tell you what that silence cost me and why it took a lifetime to break. But the price of that silence I only understood on one night. I remember the small, ordinary things most of all. The kettle whistling each morning in our red brick house, steam fogging the kitchen windows until you could draw patterns with your finger. The bus shelter in town, always blurred with mist, where neighbors' faces looked half real through the glass. And in our hallway, a crooked rope bell that gave a thin, uneven chime whenever it was pulled. Harmless details, you might think. Yet, for me, each of these became anchors to memories I could not speak aloud. Beneath the clatter of cups and the creak of doors, a truth was buried, one my mother prayed would remain unseen, and my father ensured I could never escape. The world around us believed in respectability. Inside, I learned fear. And so, after all these years, I have decided tonight I will tell it. The letter arrived on a day of rain. Perhaps you too have known the power of silence, the way it can feel both like a shield and a prison. Silence protects you in the moment, keeps the peace, allows life to carry on as though nothing were broken. Yet over time, that same silence corrodes you from within, erasing your laughter, your trust, even your sense of self. How many of us, looking back in the evening of our lives, wonder what might have changed had we dared to speak sooner? In the next minutes, I will share the secret I never voiced until now. Not to shock you, but to remind you, endurance does not mean acceptance, and truth, though delayed, can still set us free. If you have ever kept quiet simply to keep the peace, you will understand what follows. I was born in a village where the morning fog always seemed to linger a little too long, as though the sky itself was reluctant to phase the day. Our house was small, built of tired red brick, with ivy creeping across the back wall, and a front door painted green that never quite shut properly. My mother used to polish the wooden floors until they gleamed, the scent of wax mingling with tea leaves and coal smoke. Life on the surface appeared ordinary. I went to school with the other children, carried my satchel down the narrow lane, and knew the sound of every church bell in the parish. To those who saw me pass, I was just another quiet girl in a quiet English town. Yet, inside that house, my world was already beginning to shrink. I thought I had learnt to live small, to stay invisible, but the walls always saw me. My mother was a school teacher, strict and precise. She wore her hair in a tight bun, spectacles perched on her nose, her voice always measured as she corrected children's handwriting or made them recite their sums. At home, she barely spoke above a murmur, her presence drifting like a shadow that thickened or faded depending on my father's mood. My father, he was a man everyone in the village respected. He sang hymns the loudest on Sundays, his handshake was firm, his coat always brushed clean. At meetings, his opinion carried weight, and neighbors called him a pillar of the community. Behind closed doors, his footsteps were the ones that froze my spine. Outwardly, he was admired. Inwardly, he ruled with silence, with glances, with the unspoken threat of what might happen if I dared to resist. Until one name returned to our lives and all that quiet collapsed. Some objects never leave you, no matter how many years pass. For me, it was a small tin box labeled "spare keys," kept in the top drawer of the dresser. My mother insisted it was practical. A key for the back gate, a key for the shed, a key that opened a cupboard no one ever used. Beside it, there was always a chipped teacup, the handle cracked but never discarded, resting on the windowsill long after the tea inside had gone cold. And on the hall table, a stack of unopened letters, tied with string, always moved but never read. These items became more than household clutter. They became markers of a truth I couldn't name then, anchors of dread and endurance. Years later, when I see a cold cup of tea, I am transported back to that hallway. I would need one of those keys in a way I could never have imagined. Inside myself, I fought a constant battle. Reason told me to behave, to keep to routines, to follow the rules as my parents demanded. Emotion, however, rose and fell like a tide. Some mornings, I found myself almost forgetting, humming along with the radio as I tidied my books. Then, in a heartbeat, a sudden silence in the house would stop me, and I would sense a presence waiting. My steps would falter, my breath would catch, and I would question if I had dreamt it all. But dreams do not bruise, and shadows do not whisper threats in the dark. Still, I held to reason, convincing myself that as long as I kept to the pattern of school, homework, chores, perhaps things would stay contained. I ignored the scents even as they grew sharper around me. And then came the day when the ordinary sound of a lock turning no longer meant security, but the opposite. I was in the kitchen, helping my mother scrub the sink. The clock struck 6. The hour my father always returned, the front door creaked, the latch clicked, and a heaviness filled the house. Something shifted in the air. That was the threshold moment, though I did not know it then. Childhood was closing behind me, and something darker was beginning. The door shut with a single click, and nothing was ever the same again. I was 8 years old the first time I realized that silence could not protect me. It was an evening like any other, rain streaking the window panes, the smell of damp wool rising from my school jumper as it dried by the fire. My father called me into the front room. His voice was even, almost gentle, and my mother's eyes slid away as if she hadn't heard. In that instant, the home that had seemed ordinary shifted into something I no longer recognized. What happened in that room is not something I will describe in detail, but I will tell you this. A single sound has never left me. The sharp click of a lock sliding into place. That sound became the soundtrack of my childhood, a warning that safety had vanished. I thought keeping quiet would save us both. In the days that followed, the cost of silence began to show itself. I stopped sleeping through the night, lying awake with the blankets pulled up to my chin, listening for footsteps. At school, my writing faltered. The letters wavered as though they too were afraid to stand firm. I learned to smile when spoken to nod at the right moments, to appear the obedient child everyone expected. But inside, the weight of unspoken words pressed harder with each passing day. Silence bought me time, yes, but it also collected its payment in other ways. I lost my laughter, my ease, the simple trust a child should have. And silence, as I came to know, always collects its debt. I tried to keep life as normal as I could. Each morning I set the table, the same chipped teacup placed carefully on the windowsill, as if its presence might steady me. I watched my mother knot the string around yet another stack of unopened letters, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. She carried her own silence like a second skin, pretending not to see, not to know, and I pretended alongside her, convinced that if I mimicked her example, we might both be spared. But every object around me, the keys in the tin, the bell rope, the closed door whispered otherwise, until the day I read the final line of a letter and everything shifted. Perhaps you have faced such a moment too, when the cost of silence outweighs its protection, when you look into the mirror and realize that the face staring back is older, wearier than it should be. I was only a child, but even then I sensed that the silence I clung to was not saving me. It was erasing me. And so I ask you, those of you who have lived long enough to know the weight of unspoken truths, would you have chosen differently? Would you have found the words sooner? My answer, when it finally came, was nothing like I expected. The first time I tried to resist, it was almost laughably small. I lingered outside in the drizzle after school, dawdling by the corner shop, pretending to admire the jars of boiled sweets in the window. By the time I reached home, the street lamps were already flickering on, and I hoped perhaps my father would have tired of waiting. Instead, his silence was heavier than any shouted words. Supper was laid but untouched, the kettle shrieking on the hob until the water boiled away. That night, I understood that even the tiniest act of defiance carried a price. It was my first mistake, but not my last. The village itself became a cage of expectation. Neighbors praised my father for his punctuality at Dishkirti. At the parish meetings, his booming hymn at Sunday service. My mother played her role as the dutiful wife, her smile stitched into place, her voice subdued, and me? I was the quiet child everyone admired for good behavior, the one who never caused trouble. That performance was demanded of me, reinforced at every glance, every nod of approval from the community. And so I learned the cruelest truth. Society itself often becomes the accomplice of silence. For each time I longed to cry out, the weight of their trust pressed me back into submission. So I chose silence once more. At 13, I convinced myself I had found a way out. I buried myself in schoolwork, staying late in the library, copying notes until my hand cramped. Knowledge, I believed, could become my armor. If I achieved enough, perhaps I would rise above the shadow in my home. For a while it seemed to work. My teachers praised my essays, my marks improved, and my father ironically boasted of my diligence. I whispered to myself that this was victory. Yet late at night, when the door clicked shut and the familiar dread returned, I realized I had solved nothing. My false solution had crumbled. I told myself, it is finished, but it was not. Years later, Another attempt. This time it looked almost noble. I threw myself into helping at church, scrubbing pews, arranging flowers, singing in the choir. People praised my devotion. My mother clasped her hands with pride, and even my father nodded approval. Service to others, I thought, would drown out the voice inside me. But goodness built on silence is brittle. The mask eventually cracked, the fear seeped through, and one evening, as the church bells faded, I realized I had trapped myself in yet another cage. Because that was the very night the telephone rang. The call shattered the pattern. It came just after dusk, while the chipped teacup sat cold on the sill. My father lifted the receiver, listened in silence, then placed it back with a calm so deliberate it terrified me. He said nothing, but his eyes found mine across the room, and I knew a reckoning was near. All the false solves, all the years of endurance had only postponed this moment. That night, I lay awake until dawn, my body taut with fear, my mind circling the same desperate truth. There would be no more hiding. I needed a different question, a different answer. It was then that the cost of silence became unbearable. My body carried its toll, nervous tremors, headaches that throbbed behind my eyes, a heaviness that never lifted, but worse still was the erosion of trust, the way I flinched from kindness, doubted sincerity, recoiled from any hand stretched toward me. My world had narrowed to the walls of that house, the motifs of dread etched into every corner, the tin box of keys, the letters bound in string, the chair forever empty at supper. And as exhaustion hollowed me out, a single truth rose clear above the noise. If I did not find another way, I would vanish entirely. Someone, I prayed, must ask the right question at last. It was a teacher who first saw through me, Miss Lawrence, stern but fair, with graying hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and spectacles that magnified her kind eyes. One afternoon, after class, she asked me to stay behind. I remember the dust motes floating in the shaft of light across the desks, the muffled shouts of boys playing football outside. She placed her hands flat on the desk and simply said, "Are you all right?" I tried to nod, to smile as I always did, but something faltered. She leaned forward and whispered words no one had ever spoken to me before. "I believe you." For a moment, I could hardly breathe, as though the weight I had carried for years had shifted slightly. That sentence cracked the silence, and nothing could restore it to what it was. The next steps were small, almost timid, yet they felt monumental. Miss Lawrence gave me a notebook, encouraging me to write whatever I could not say. At first, my hands shook so violently I could hardly hold the pen, the ink blotting into dark stains. But slowly, the words began to form. Fragments, fears, nights I thought I would never escape. She helped me make a plan, simple, clear actions that marked the first boundaries I'd ever drawn for myself. A meeting arranged with someone beyond the school, a conversation recorded in careful notes. For once, my trembling did not stop me. Each word written, each truth shared was a step away from the abyss. By the time I placed the pen down, my hand no longer shook. Hope arrived quietly, almost like dawn seeping through thin curtains. I began to notice the world in ways I had not before. The way birdsong broke the morning stillness, the kindness of a neighbor offering a scone wrapped in a napkin, the relief of laughter bubbling up unexpectedly with a friend. They were small signs, perhaps insignificant to others, but to me they were proof that a different life might exist beyond fear. Miss Lawrence reminded me daily, courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Each morning, I woke with a tiny flame still burning inside me, and one day I resolved, tomorrow I will knock on a door I have avoided all my life. Hope, fragile but real, was beginning to take root. Preparing for that confrontation was unlike anything I had ever done. I practiced sentences under my breath while washing dishes, tested my voice while hanging clothes on the line. I imagined standing in front of him, imagined my mother's face, imagined the silence that would follow my words. Miss Lawrence rehearsed with me, her tone steady, her eyes unwavering. We gathered the evidence I had begun to collect, notes, dates, fragments that painted a clearer picture than memory alone. My heart pounded, but I was no longer the voiceless child. For the first time, I had an ally. For the first time, I was not entirely alone. I told myself, I am ready until I met his eyes again. The day of reckoning did not announce itself with thunder or shouts. It began quietly, with the shuffle of papers and the weight of a folder pressed into my hands. Inside were the notes I had written in trembling script, the dates carefully recorded, the fragments of evidence I had managed to hold on to. Miss Lawrence sat beside me as we prepared, her calm presence like a shield. Say little, she reminded me. Say only what is true. Say it once and clearly. I repeated her words until they etched themselves into my mind. Even the smallest detail, an unlocked cupboard, a missing belt, the bruise that had faded too slowly, became part of the story I was finally ready to tell. I whispered to myself, speak little, but speak enough. When the moment came, the room was smaller than I remembered. My father sat at the table, his hands folded neatly, his face unreadable. My mother hovered at the edge, her lips pressed tight as though holding back every word she should have said years before. And then it was me, standing there, my knees trembling, but my voice steady. I said what I had written, nothing more and nothing less. I spoke of nights that should never have existed, of silence that had strangled me, of the truth I had been forced to carry. For a long moment the house was utterly still, as though the walls themselves held their breath. And when I finished, the room was silent in a way I'd never known before. The aftermath came swiftly, yet it felt dreamlike. A call made, a car arriving with strangers who spoke firmly but kindly. My father's face remained impassive as he was led away, as though he believed even this would dissolve into nothing. My mother wept, but her tears were for the shame, not for me. Watching her fold into herself, I realized that her silence had always been her choice, and she had chosen it over me. And in that moment, the grief was sharp, for the family that had never truly been mine, for the mother who had chosen blindness, for the childhood that could not be returned. And then something I could not have predicted happened, altering everything once more. I expected fear to linger, but what arrived instead was resolve. That night, as the house stood hollow, I walked from room to room and touched the objects that had once bound me. The tin of keys, the chipped cup, the bell rope hanging slack. Each one still carried its weight, but I knew now they no longer held power over me. The truth had been spoken, and though it came at a terrible cost, it was a cost I was willing to bear. I understood then that there was no path backwards, no reclaiming of what had been lost. But there was finally a path forwards. I chose truth, and I accepted the price it demanded. In the weeks that followed, the silence of the house felt heavier than it ever had before. Without my father's footsteps echoing through the hall, without my mother's restrained voice filling the kitchen, the rooms seemed both safer and lonelier. I found myself waking in the night, heart racing, expecting to hear the dreaded click of a lock. But it never came. Slowly, the fear that had lived in my body began to loosen its grip. The first time I slept through until dawn, I woke with tears on my cheeks, not from terror, but from relief. I had begun tentatively to sleep again. Healing did not arrive in a single rush. It came in fragments, in habits I built carefully, like laying bricks for a new foundation. I joined a women's group at the church, where voices rose in laughter I had once thought impossible. I tended a small garden patch behind the cottage, planting roses that demanded patience and rewarded me with bloom after bloom. I filled notebooks with words, memories, confessions, questions that no longer weighed only on me. Each act, however ordinary, was a reclamation. They reminded me that life could be rebuilt, not perfectly, but honestly. I understood at last, forgiveness was not about forgetting. It was about remembering without allowing the memory to wound me further. To forgive was to carry memory without handing it the power to harm. And so, in my later years, I came to see courage differently. It is not grand or loud, not the stuff of speeches or medals. Courage, I discovered, is often quiet. It is the trembling hand that still reaches for the pen. It is the voice that falters but speaks anyway. It is the act of choosing truth even when the cost is everything you thought you needed. Looking back, I do not pretend the scars vanished. They remain, etched in the lines of my story. But they do not define me anymore. The lesson I pass on is simple, though it took me decades to learn. Courage is a quiet labor, repeated day after day, until the silence finally breaks. If you're listening to me now and find yourself in a shadowed place, know this: you do not need to leap into the light all at once. Begin with something small, something safe. Set one boundary, however modest, a closed door you choose not to unlock, a truth you whisper to a trusted friend, a sentence you finally write on paper. The road forward is not built in a single stride. It is laid brick by brick, choice by choice. Start with one small boundary. That is enough. And if, as you listened, you heard echoes of your own life in my words, I invite you to join me. Leave a comment that simply says, "Me too," and share one boundary you will set this week. It may seem simple, but it is a declaration. That silence will not have the final word. And if you know someone who carries their own unspoken weight, pass this story to them tonight, not as entertainment, but as a gift of courage from one soul to another. We are never as alone as we think, because my story, though it ends here, is not the end of all stories. Life has a way of weaving one chapter into the next, often in places we least expect. Next time, I will tell you about a notebook I found in an old church vestry, a notebook that changed how I saw my family and myself. Until then, May you hold fast to the quiet courage that begins always with a single word spoken aloud.